Welcome to this Stockholm School of Economics Alumni Webinar on the important topic of climate change, and more specifically on the role of investors and shareholders in tackling climate change, which has been organized by the Stockholm School of Economics together with the UK Alumni Hub, the UK Friends of SSE, which I'm representing. There are alumni and corporate partners with us joining from all over the world, which is a clear reflection on the global reach that SSE has today. The school is continuously developing in response to changes in the world around us, and today's topic is no exception, with the global goals being part of the curriculum, and MISUM, the Research Center for Sustainable Markets, being two of just many examples. As alumni and corporate partners, we play an important role in all of this. We continue to benefit from what the school has to offer, and we contribute. Our input helps the SSE to stay relevant. We act as ambassadors in the effort to recruit the brightest students, and we remember that only 18% of the Stockholm School of Economics budget is funded by state grants, which makes many of us choose to contribute financially as well. In short, you are important to the SSE. I hope you enjoy this event and that you continue to engage with the school. Before we properly start, I have a few housekeeping points to share with you. Due to the number of participants, you have been muted, but you are very welcome to submit any questions you may have in the chat, and there will be time for a Q&A session after the panel discussion. Also, as you will have seen already, we are recording the event, and we will send you a link to it after this webinar. And with that, I'm so proud to hand over to today's moderator, Maja Rebermark, who is Communications Director at the Earth Commission at Future Earth, who will introduce the webinar and the speakers.
Thank you very much, Annette. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. For the next hour, we're going to be hearing from a really fascinating group of experts and industry actors on the substantial topic of sustainable investments and the transformation towards a low carbon economy. So under the title of Can Investors Change or Save the World? The role of shareholders in tackling climate change, we're going to explore different strategies that investors are currently using to pressure and facilitate corporations' progress towards a low carbon economy. My name is Maja Rebermark. I work as the Comms Director for the Earth Commission at Future Earth, which is a global network of scientists and researchers and different innovators collaborating for a more sustainable planet. So really happy to be with everybody here today. And I now want to jump in. We've got a lot to cover in the next hour. So to introduce our speakers and thank them all for joining us today. Many SSE alumni. We have Erik Wotridge, the Head of Sustainability at Tele2. Erik is responsible for drafting and implementing the sustainability strategy, reports, communications, and all of the sustainability work at Tele2. Erik, welcome. I can't see you on my screen. There we go. Hi. Carina Silberg, Head of Governance and Sustainability at Electa. Carina leads the governance and sustainability team at Electa and works with corporate governance, ESG integration, also sustainability. Welcome, Carina. We have Robert Vitsky, Portfolio Manager, Sustainable Investments at SEB Investment Management, with broad experience spanning from asset and portfolio management, sustainable investments, corporate government and ownership dialogues. And then last but not least, an ex-colleague of mine, Dr. Emma Sjöström, who is the co-director of the Sustainable Finance Initiative at MISUM, the Mistra Center of Sustainable Markets at SSE. She conducts research on sustainable finance and ESG investment, and mainly from a management and organizational perspective. Welcome, everybody. I think this is going to be a fascinating set of discussions. So before we kick off with the first talk, to set the context for discussions, Emma's going to share her research insights with us on sustainable investments, and particularly through how active ownership lens and examine how shareholder activism can be an important part of low carbon transformation work. So welcome, Emma. The floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Maja, and thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be meeting this particular group of people today and that you wanted to tune into this topic. I've been doing research at the Stockholm School of Economics since 2003 and always on the topic of shareholder engagement and how my interest in the financial market is very much as a change agent and how can you seek to influence companies through your ownership position. And that's also what we're going to talk about today. So it's a very timely topic. I'm going to see now if I can share my screen. There we go. And then try to put it in presentation mode. There we go. So can investors save the world? The role of shareholders in tackling climate change. And I think that the issue that is very much discussed right now and has been for a few years is when it comes to the fossil intense companies, is it better to stay invested and use your ownership position to try to influence them in a more sustainable direction, or is it better to divest and just sell all your shares? And so I might not actually be able to answer that question for you today, but what I think is interesting to understand is rather what are some of the mechanisms at work here, because we probably need both of these things to happen, but you know, when is it effective and how and when is it not? That's what I think is interesting. So, but let's just back up for a moment, because probably not everybody on this call is working with sustainable investment. And so to get us on all the same page, I wanted to just do a quick basic gauge of where sustainable investment is today. So sustainable investment, of course, is a very broad concept. It could be anything from green bonds to a clean tech fund to, you know, just excluding armament and alcohol and tobacco and unethical things, or it could be, you know, a low carbon type of portfolio. So it's you know, a whole fruit basket of things. But if you look globally, according to a recent report, 35.9% of total assets globally under management are sustainable investments. So it's no longer a small niche, it's going more mainstream. And you have the big asset managers of the world like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Goldman Sachs, all those big names working in some way or another with sustainable investment, or ESG as it's often called, environment, social, and governance. And so as you can see in the graph here, it's very much a Western phenomenon. We have United States and Europe leading, Canada. Japan is up there because they have a really big pension fund that's applying sustainability. So it's gone, I would say, from a special interest to now being something that everybody talks about in the financial industry in some way or another. So what I think is important for us to understand, if we're going to have this discussion about whether investors can play a role for change or not, is also what are the different motivations for investors to invest sustainably. So one, of course, would be financial return, because many investors seem to believe that if you do apply sustainability to your financial analysis and so on, then you may be able to have a better long-term return. And there was actually a survey that was published recently by some prominent researchers showing that many investors do believe that climate risks are do have financial implications and are already materializing in their portfolios. Another motivation would be more to align your investment with your values. You want to feel good about how you invest. You don't want to invest in things and go contrary to what you think is important. So that's a different type of motivation. Or it may be that you want to have an impact, you want to save the world, and you think that by investing, you can somehow also be a change agent. You can do all of these at the same time, but it's just important to understand where you're coming from if you're also trying to understand impact. So what I do think, though, is that a lot of investors, especially on the retail side, and not the least also campaigning organizations who are now getting into this field of sustainable investment and having opinions about it, is that a basic idea, and as you can see, the figure is called a typical and erroneous model of divestment effect, that you divest from say an oil company. That's not good for them. You don't want your shares to not be attractive. So that's going to give you some financial hardship, and it's going to be painful for the company that these shares are sold. And so to remedy that, you try to do something different to make your shareholders happy again. It doesn't really work this way. And you, of course, all being trained at the Stockholm School of Economics know how the financial market works. And because the stock market is much a secondary market, if I sell my shares to Maya, then nothing has really changed. But still, it seems that this is a very go-to model for some investors. It could work like this on the debt market, because that's much more of a primary market in the bond market, say. But the stock market is very much a secondary market. And the thing with fossil is also that a lot of those companies are more active in the bond market than the listed equity. But with that said, it doesn't mean, though, that divestment can't have an effect. It just doesn't work in this way. So what it can do is to stigmatize, because the big deal with divestment is the announcement that media has a headline about it. This, asset owner, this pension fund divested. And so what that can do is help stigmatize this industry, spur more of a discussion about how we need to put a price on carbon, the whole idea around a carbon budget and so on. Perhaps it makes it easier for legislators to make those types of decisions on that we need for transitioning towards the low carbon economy, when you have inputs from also the financial market and signals about how this is not a desirable industry. But that's very difficult to measure or to capture, or to report on. That you have to then have faith in, you think that this is how it's going to work, and have that as your motivation. So again, boycotts, I think retail investors think about how, in the store you buy organic bananas, and you don't buy the other bananas, but on the stock market, it doesn't really work that way. And that's a communication issue that I think some fund management companies and some pension funds will have to deal with when they justify that they still do hold fossils in their portfolio. So let's see. What's then, let's say that you decide to still own companies that are not yet the perfect company. What does research have to say then about what works? Because there is actually a whole body of literature that we can lean on to make the most strategic type of choice around how we engage with companies. And one thing that stands out, if you read all of the literature, is that the size of your shareholding actually is not critical, because that will be the counter argument sometimes. Think about the Swedish national pension funds, for example. Now, most of them have sold their fossils, but not all of them. And so the argument would go, well, you have such a small holding, so why would they listen to you? Apparently, if you look at a number of cases, it's not critical. What does matter is that you have legitimacy, and that, what does that mean then? That means that you have a good business case, that you can explain how this is in the best interest of the company, that you have an understanding of the fact that it's not a black and white type of situation for most companies, unlike campaigners who like to really have a black and white picture or reality. But be more of a speaking partner, maybe supply them with new information that's important to them in this context, and so on. So that's also why it's important to think about, when you do engage, who you team up with, and can that help you to build that credibility. And so one thing that I've noted is that more and more now investors are coming together to try to influence corporations in larger coalitions. And that too seems to be a successful strategy. So you have something called a Climate Action 100+, where many investors have come together and they target many companies at the same time. So they've selected the 167 largest CO2 emitters and have a number of requests that they want to see fulfilled over a number of years. So I think engagement has become more strategic, maybe more professional, if you will, over the last years. And so, but again, coming back to, you know, what's what here, engagement can also be just sending a letter and say, we think this is important. It can be a lot of things. It can be just information gathering. So if the question is engagement effective? Well, it depends on how you do it and what you do and what you're trying to achieve. And then engagement, of course, is not only having this bilateral dialogue, it's also about going to the annual general meeting. And what we have seen there in research is that, so for those of you who are not familiar, you go to the annual general meeting and then you propose something and everybody gets to vote on it. So you have an increasing amount of resolutions, so that is suggestions on sustainability. And it used to be that they got very low votes, but now they're getting sometimes quite high votes. And it turns out that the proposals that get the highest votes are the ones that talk about that they want increased disclosure and reporting. And for engagement in general, you have a much higher chance of getting what you want out of the engagement, the less it costs for the company to make that change, which I guess is intuitive, but it's also validated by research. So disclosure will be easier to attain than a more substantive change. So there too, you have to make up your mind, and if you think that's if that's enough, is that what you want, or are you looking for some other type of change? Also, companies who have been previously targeted by these types of issues are more likely to get higher votes. So it's worthwhile to be persistent with your resolutions. Those who are more dependent on reputation for critical resources are more likely to get high votes or to respond positively to these types of events. So large companies in the retail sector, and so on. So I guess my main point here is to say that there is, we now have enough of a track record of engagement and academic research that have looked at this from all various angles, that we know quite a bit about what works and what doesn't work, and that can hopefully help inform the market. So lastly, I want to talk about how I think that shareholder engagement is taking a new turn, or it seems like people think so, at least after the events of this spring. I don't know, those of you who work in the financial market may be familiar with this, but so in the spring, when ExxonMobil had its annual general meeting, a small activist fund called Engine No. 1 suggested to the annual general meeting that Exxon would take on a few new board members who had a background in clean tech and who were knowledgeable in climate change. And Exxon did not want this. And they called up their biggest shareholders to try to have them not vote for this. But Exxon, Engine No. 1 managed to get support from BlackRock and some other big owners, and they succeeded. So I think this is an example. And of course, we have yet to see if these new board members are going to be a game changer or not for Exxon. That's an open question. But what I find interesting is that now the corporate governance, the traditional corporate governance function is also being used for climate purposes. And thinking of boards, there's a very new study that shows, for example, that companies with more women on the board are more likely to make formal carbon decrease commitments, for example. So for a researcher, there's new empirics all the time that we can use to try to better understand what's happening in this space and what works and what doesn't. So I think that, going back to the question about should I stay or should I go? The more you sort of dig into this and understand the various mechanisms, the harder it is to answer that question. But I look forward to speaking more about this together with the panel. This is my last slide, just to direct you, if you're interested in this particular topic, to learn more, go to our website, and there are reports that are, easy access and so on, and for free, that you can read. Thank you.
Emma, thank you very much. That was fantastic. I love that you brought up engine number one at the end of your presentation. I think they're a really interesting case study of how this kind of shareholder activism is working and playing out in real time. Just adding for the audience, if you want to find out more about this group, there was actually a very interesting TED talk last week that they were part of in the countdown in Edinburgh, which was with Shell, engine number one, and then also a climate activist from Scotland, talking about these very same issues. And it's quite an open and interesting conversation. So I can share that with the alum team to send out afterwards as well. So jumping into the discussion, I mean, I would like to ask the panel to reflect on Emma's presentation, but then also from their perspectives, kind of what are you seeing in your day-to-day work? If we think about where we are right now, what's the trade looking like? And Karina, if I can actually direct this question to you first, and also Robert, it'd be great to hear your take on this. What are your experiences of active ownership playing out within an industry context? And do you find that engagement or selling is having more impact? Great to hear what you see. Karina.
Thanks, and thank you, Emma, for that interesting introduction, because I think you really frame some of the features that we see in our industry today, and things that's been debated back and forth. And obviously, it's like you say, it's a bit of a combination of the both. I mean, ideally, we would see perhaps either or. If every investor would engage, we would definitely see some more change. Or if every investor would actually have exit as an option, that could also lead potentially to that change. But in reality, it's a combination of the two. And I think you brought up some interesting examples, but from our point of view, Alecta, we have a global portfolio in the sense of North America, Europe, and with a dominance to Sweden, a home bias, so to say. And I think what we notice also, it's very different in the different geographic markets, and it's got to do with what Emma was saying also about the corporate governance structures and traditions that you have in the respective markets. In Sweden, I think many institutional investors have really a good record of engaging with Swedish companies. We do that through various channels, and we usually have access quite high up in the hierarchy, so you can have really meaningful dialogue. But at the same time, I think it's a difference of how you own that will affect whether engagement or divestment is the thing. And to sum up, I mean, if you're, I say stuck, but of course there are different opinions on that. In an index, you have some strategies, but if you're active and you actually pick those companies, you selected those companies, you want to engage with them because you choose them because you think they're good, then you want to engage, and probably you have access to that channel for meaningful dialogue, and you can choose to sort of collaborate with other investors to also increase your weight in that dialogue. But of course, even so, at one point, if you're not seeing any positive indication that you can steer that company in the right direction, it is not meaningful to continue on, and divestment will be an option. So yeah. I think that's
an interesting point. Robert, what are your reflections along those lines?
No, I mean, this is a very interesting topic that has been discussed, and Emma brought up some great points. I mean, selling is the last option for any investment manager that truly invests long term. So engagement is always the first step, but it's, as Karina said, it's a dynamic step-by-step process that we need to adhere to, and sometimes. I mean, not sometimes, always, you do your fundamental research before you actually sell something. So that needs to be understood, that people in the industry don't just sell because customers don't want to own it. Yeah, in certain funds, in certain strategies, yes, but most often than not, there is a fundamental analysis behind it. So looking at the one thing you mentioned, the Climate Action 100 engagement, it's obvious and it's clear for us doing the fundamental research behind it that that engagement is important, but we do not think that strategically we can be part of that investment movement by owning it. We can still engage in that party, but we had to divest from those companies, most of those companies, because we just don't think that they will meet the requirements that we are ahead of us with the 1.5 degrees. So even if you divest, you're still engaging within these frameworks just to push the agenda forward, going forward. But many of those companies will never reach the goals that we want. So Engine 1 is an excellent example and one that I really like. Unfortunately, changing a business model from an Exxon perspective, where you need to kill your own business in order for you to survive, that's a long journey, and it's a strategic bet that sometimes better to be seen outside and trying to, you know, somehow influence that process. But you always have a fundamental view. And the important thing that I think, just to summarize it, is that we need to all agree what is realistic and what is good to, you know, engage around, because the collaboration and the more investors seeing the things the way we want them to see it from a sustainability perspective, the better results there will be going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting your point also about the having to kill your business in some cases, or those businesses that maybe aren't going to, you know, kind of hit the 10-year mark stretch. I'm just adding another query in here in terms of sort of business transformation, you know, because Karina, you've mentioned, you know, you work with companies as well to help them on their transitions. And also, you know, Robert, when we think about, you know, these big major oil industries or fossil fuel industries, yeah, that's a huge ask, and it's a big piece of work to do. But there's also the transformation component. I mean, this conversation with Shell that I mentioned earlier, one of the fascinating things about their models as well is they were actually one of the first people to design the lithium battery. So as well as looking at renewables and looking at, you know, other business models, there are, and this is of course market-based as well, there are advances, you know, for a number of companies to really take task with this transformation and getting us off fossil fuels. But I want to bring Eric in terms of, you know, from your perspective within the company context, do you think there are certain things that need to change in practice for active ownership to reach a bigger impact tipping point? Or, you know, what do you see from where you're standing?
No, well, from my perspective, I welcome any type of active ownership, and in my role as head of sustainability, I think that the investors are, of course, one of the most important stakeholders that I have to address, and I think that having owners that show with sort of an active interest in our sustainability efforts, and also are very clear about the demands that they put on us, that we're seeing to a higher and higher extent, I must say, in the more than 2 years I've been at Tele2 now. This is really something that is accelerating and quite rapidly. But from my perspective, it's definitely something I welcome, because this is something that gives me a tool to work with internally. And it's, you know, it's when we have big active owners that put demands on sustainability efforts, that is something that gets both the board and management attention very, very quickly, and can help us that are driving the change from the inside as well. So I definitely welcome that kind of involvement from investors.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that takes us quite nicely to this, you know, the transition story as well, and the practical components of, okay, well, what needs to happen and how. And if we're connecting that with the legitimacy, business legitimacy that we've talked about, but then also, you know, the kind of the risk analysis within the science community, this is a question to all of you, you know, how much of the sort of the risk analysis that we see, you know, based on IPCC scenarios or International Energy Agency assessments, how does those science evidence-based narratives make it into the long-term valuation process? And I think you'll have some quite interesting different viewpoints on where that sits. Open floor. Who would like to take that one first?
Well, I guess. Oh, sorry. Should I start?
Go ahead, Robert. Karina was first.
I wasn't
last
on
time.
mute, so you were on mute. So, I mean, this is a very, very good question and a highly relevant question, especially just before now COP26, where everyone is declaring the net zero type of initiatives that everyone is taking, and the IPCC or the IEA scenarios help us identify physical risk and the transition story and what we need to do as asset owners or investment managers to transform this. We are still at an early stage of this process, unfortunately, because there is very little data out there that we can rely on, and there's this continuous struggle. Okay, is this relevant? Is that carbon emission data relevant? Have our data providers, classified a certain instrument to a certain sector that has this estimated emissions and all that? So this needs to accelerate much faster than we are, but it's having to start, so it's starting to have an effect on how we look at companies and how we look at sectors, because it's not enough to have a willingness to transform. You also need to be prepared already today, because 2030 and 2050 are quite close nowadays. So that means that not many companies that derive their revenue to 95 to 98% from fossil fuel will be able to transform during the 15 years. So what we are trying to do is basically, by using these type of scenarios, by knowing what type of budget is, trying to transition in the companies that can actually make it, even though they have fossil imprint right now. We are trying to catch them on the other side because of these scenarios, so that we know which company is going to meet it. Because strategically, everyone is talking about it, but not very few are actually doing it. And that's the key here. And that's how we use these scenarios to catch them.
Yeah. Karina?
Well, I can add sort of a really hands-on perspective to what Robert is saying, really, because I mean, obviously, I kind of share the view, and the narrative is really important for us in identifying future themes in the investments, etc. But just really taking the IPCC and EAA components and using them, we've done a risk management group has done sort of a real stress test on our portfolio on all the assets using IPCC scenarios and EAA, especially the sort of carbon prices. And we've done sort of calculations. What would it require? What will happen in the future in our portfolio based on these scenarios, using different ones. And it's roughly calculated, but we can see that that would definitely lead the prices that it would require to get to 1.0. It's definitely putting a lot of business out of business and eradicating values, definitely. But it's these calculus are very rough, and they sort of assume that the business sit still in their boat, change nothing. That's how we calculate it, and then you'll half you would even half the value, sort of. But of course, it's not realistic that a company would see their whole business, going down the drain without acting. So obviously, that's the sort of perspective that we bring into the analysis. But the numbers, like Robert was talking, the data, even the price of carbon, all these data is assumptions in a way. And while we can see that where the development is heading, in what direction, it's still very difficult for us to actually use it in hard evaluation. So it becomes a narrative. It becomes something that enlightens where are the risks in the value chain of one individual asset, for example. But I'd say that starting out slowly for the past few years, I think investors has been much more influenced by the scientific reports than earlier. I think it definitely has had a different toll the past few years.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on this point about data. So I think this is really interesting, in the sense that, Robert, you mentioned, that the data, you don't have the data that you can rely on. And also, Karina, you're saying that a lot of the scenarios, you know, that it's not concrete enough for your assessments going forward. I mean, I think there's two different sides of it here, because the science in terms of like the IPCC science is like the most solid it can possibly be. And then there's the question about, well, how does that translate into the context of the type of data that you need to be able to make these types of projections and assessments going forward? And I just wonder, and maybe Eric, you can come in on this one as well, is what impact do you think that the new EU taxonomy will have on the development of sort of green financing going forward, on businesses with their reporting? Is this going to have the type of impact that will bring this circle together, you know, scenarios, reality of business, and actually the transition that we need to facilitate in practice?
I think Robert and Karina are more qualified to answer that than I am. I can just say from a corporate perspective, and that it's I'm hopeful that this is something that can really help on that, and I think that it's tying on to the previous question as well, that this is from our perspective as a company that sets a high ambition in the sustainability area. It's of course important that we also get that sort of recognition from investors, and that it is something that is really taken into consideration in the investment decisions, so that it's not something that is sort of a parallel track. We have the regular investment decisions that we make, and then we have sort of an ESG profile, but that's kind of just on the side. So sort of really integrating that fully is something that I really look forward to seeing, and sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Robert, Karina, what do you feel about EU taxonomy?
How do I feel about it? I feel a lot.
Yeah.
Let's just, you know, returning to one of Emma's pictures in her presentation, where she said, you know, it's 35% of the asset under management that is really going sustainable. And she said, you know, that those criteria varies a lot. So, I mean, what the EU taxonomy is doing, what it really is providing, it's providing us with a common language or common definitions for what is deep green, what is required to sort of, you know, align with Paris. But having said that, it's important to understand that any journey or movement towards that deep green is really going to have an impact sort of on you know, on the real economy and its greening. Mm-hmm. And just, you know, I think also for us, it will be sort of a reference point, because looking at the assets today that are really aligned with deep green, they are so limited that, you know, if all pension money and all asset money would, you know, run to those, then we would actually possibly, you know, risk a green bubble with overpriced assets and, you know, not perhaps considering other risks. But on the other hand, if we're accepting that, you know, we can move towards, we can use the taxonomy as a reference point. You know, our analyst hasn't had a climate reference point for each, you know, different company and sectors before. And now understanding, you know, for transportation, this is the ultimate thresholds. Mm-hmm. Then you understand when the car fleet is developing towards that. So I think, you know, from our point of view, that's the taxonomy value.
This is fantastic. Emma, how's your, I mean, I know you do a lot of work with that also with colleagues in SSE and in NISM. Do you see a sort of long-term, well, yeah, how do you see the potential impact of the new taxonomy, especially in relationship to active ownership?
Yeah, it seems that I think the taxonomy has been useful also for a lot more conversation between companies and investors and analysts. It's given not the least the financial analysts a reason to really deep dive into what this all means. So maybe a side effect of this is that it's put a lot more attention to these issues in this ecosystem of financial market actors, I would say. But my general impression is that there's still a lot of confusion about the taxonomy. Companies don't know, they can't assess if they're compliant or not, and so then investors don't also know if their portfolios are compliant. So it's you know, very much a work in progress right now. And from what I understand, it's going to be, I mean, right now it's very much a green taxonomy, but that is going to be broader and include social and so on. So I guess we'll just have to accept that it's we're in the beginning of some type of process here, but hopefully it can be as meaningful as it was intended down the road.
Robert, I saw you nodding there.
Yeah, I mean, I quite agree with Karina and Emma as well. I'm hoping that it's going to be something that we can rely on. I mean, it's just a classification system of economic activities within businesses that we invest into. So that's the key important. It's not sustainability from that perspective. It's an environmental picture of a process, basically, if you want to simplify it a little bit. So for us, what it highlights is basically, okay, are you ready for the shift that is needed from a company perspective? How much of your revenues are dependent on change? Because if you have low amounts of taxonomy revenue, and please remember that this is still a lot of estimation going on here, but if you have lower levels of revenue, that means that you probably need to invest a lot of money to transform your business, or you need to change the way you do things. So that means costs going forward, and that's how we are aiming to use the taxonomy partially to identify companies that are prepared, are willing, and combine that with what we spoke about before with the IPCC scenarios, the science-based targets, and other frameworks that help us and drive the engagement towards more taxonomy-aligned revenues, or more holistic view on how to create long-term profitability. And it's just a tool. So we can't hang everything on the taxonomy. It's a partial picture of the whole company's sustainability work, just to be a little bit critical of the hype around that.
Yeah, can I just fill in on the fact
yes,
that usually you hear how are you how much of your portfolio is going to be taxonomy aligned? It's a I mean, the taxonomy is binary too. Either you meet the thresholds or you don't. And I think it's important to understand that it's even the transition towards it. It's what Robert is describing is very important. I mean, obviously, we are going to assess them not being able to sort of move in that direction. But it's very important to understand that it's the journey towards it. So for us, it's not binary in that sense.
Yeah. And Eric, how are you sort of preparing for it in that sense? More reporting in a different way, tying it to the value story.
Yeah, and I think as we've touched upon already, I think a big challenge for us is how unclear everything still is, and how sort of this was one of the areas that I, at the onset of this year, set out that we're really going to be on the forefront of this. Like, we want to be early out with information, we want to show the market like we've got this under control, and then like every 2 months, whatever it was kept changing. So how are we able to sort of position ourselves when there are so many changes going on? So it's still challenging, but I also believe that once that's sort of settles down and everything is clear, that will be a good framework for us to use in communicating.
And also again, this is for everybody, so please raise your hand or jump in if you have a burning answer. How do you think all of this, everything that we've been discussing specifically with, well, not necessarily just the taxonomy, but the transition, the challenges, how does all of the above kind of impact current metrics for actually either making money or for generating financial value and that narrative? Do we think this is part of the problematic, finding that legitimacy to keep the transition going forward? Emma, maybe you thinking.
I need to think about that for a minute. If somebody else wants to jump in, then please do.
I can give you my thoughts at least. I mean, all this data will create transparency at companies. The more transparent companies are, the better decision making we can make. So we will be better at managing money long term by adhering to all these different parties. Right now, it's going to be if you can interpret numbers the right way, it might be an edge short term, because everyone is interpreting the numbers differently. Everyone is looking at it differently. So if you assess the numbers correctly, this is an alpha generator short term, because you know what type of trends are moving, you know which type of companies are positioned to thrive in this environment. So but the greater good will come from this transparency, and that's what I'm looking forward, that the whole world is moving towards a more transparent, more accountable world.
Is it fast enough is one of the other questions. And I think maybe, Eric, what support do you think companies need to spur ahead? Because whilst the transparency and those components are fantastic on these steps, to really, we've got, under a decade to halve emissions. So we have to move really fast. What is missing? What are those pain points that are making it harder for companies to spur on?
Well, I think touching on what I said earlier as well, I think something that would definitely help us is to have a strong investor pressure on this. If it's clear from investors that all companies in our portfolio has to halve their emissions by 2030, that's it can't be clearer than that. And I think it's, from our perspective, it's we're beginning to see these sort of absolute requirements as well. We have one investor, is not a very big investor, but still one that we care about, saying that if you don't improve your ESG rating from a specific rating, by the end of the year, we will sell our shares. It's the first time that I've heard that, but that makes it very, very clear that what the demands are. But then, of course, we are profit-generating organizations that are dependent on our customers. So it is really important that we see a strong demand from customers, both in our case B2B and B2C customers, that this is something that is important for them. And there have been other discussions, I know, on green premiums. Are you prepared to pay more for sustainable products as a way of recouping costs that we would incur in producing them? I think is one other perspective as well. If I try to take more of a macro view on it, I think a big challenge will be renewable energy. As something that, when I look to our own operations, we now use 100% renewable electricity. That's reduced our emissions by 90%. And Swedish and the Baltics, where we have our operations, it's not that difficult to find renewable electricity, which makes it easy for us to reduce our emissions really, really quickly. But taking a macro perspective, and also as demand for renewable electricity increases and demand for electricity in general increases, I think that's going to be a really big challenge as well, and something that us investors, customers, and corporates are not going to be able to solve all by ourselves.
Fantastic, thank you. On that note, I'm seeing that we have 12 minutes left of this conversation, and there's so much more to dive into. I'm also conscious that we want to be able to give some space to questions that will be coming in from the audience. So I'll just say, if we could wrap up this first part of panel discussion, and if each of you could try and crystallize one last comment in answer to the question of what single change would you like to see happen in your workplaces tomorrow that would facilitate rapid acceleration towards decarbonisation in the financial markets. I'll start with the left of my screen. Robert.
You're hanging me out to dry there. No, but seriously, clear pricing of externalities and changing the definition of shareholder value to stakeholder value. Those are the two things that will move this forward much faster than anything. Of course, supported by regulation. That's what we shouldn't forget.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Emma.
Yeah, so in my own workplace, I guess I would just wish for more research funding so we can learn more about this. But but more about what's, if I put myself in the shoes of financial market actors, I also think that it is key, like Robert is saying, that we get a price on carbon and that we have regulation that supports this, because the financial market can only do so much, and also the business community in the way that we have now set up this system. So to get the playing field to be in the way it needs to be, you also need political will, and that's the purpose of those who we elect to steer us in the direction that we need to go, even if sometimes there's trade-offs in that too. And that's no easy mission, of course, how you do that with social justice and everything else. But I think we cannot lean on the financial market alone, clearly, to solve it.
No, it's all hands on deck everywhere. Eric.
And I'll build on that. And I mean, a carbon tax or some sort of cap and trade scheme as one starting point, and then the second point would be sort of very clear investor demands on what is expected from us, like having set science-based targets. For instance.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Karina.
Yeah, I was going to say something, but I just want, reflecting on the previous speakers' voices, because I can second all of it. But it's like one of those Mr. or Mr. Universe contests. What do you wish for? World peace. What do we wish for? Carbon pricing. And sometimes we get a lot of critiques because we keep reiterating that we want carbon prices, but isn't that just a way to shy away from really impacting your own portfolios, etc.? And I think you can do both, and I think it's so important that the investment community and the business community really signals that we're ready for a carbon price, because ultimately that will have to affect policymakers. I mean, we're part of these societies and we elect those policymakers, and eventually I think there's the tipping point there. But what I really wanted to say on a very concrete measure, it actually relates to something Emma was saying too, that we've been very focused on equity in our portfolio and how we can affect it through our shareholding. But I think also the credit part and the lending part is very essential. And I mean, we've been starting to look at it and sort of draw out the same type of data that we do for equities, but we're not in that we don't have the same avenues for engagement. We do have avenues for engagement. I think that's something to reflect upon going forward.
Thank you, everyone. A brilliant, fascinating conversation. I would love to keep on digging into this with you both, all four of you. But it's time to hear a little bit from our colleagues on the call. Does anybody have any questions that they want to put to our speakers? You can pop in the chat. I have one that's been sent to me already. This one is, how do you evaluate nascent technologies or companies that have theoretical potential in tackling climate change? So I think that might be one to Robert or Karina. Do we have any hands up?
I can read. I think I may have to pass this one to Robert, because that's one of the sort of, I say not shortcomings, but I like that being pension fund, and with our investment strategy, we're really not having focus on new business models, and I guess there's a lot of venture capital that can really be fruitful there. But I'll pass it on to Robert.
Scapegoat. Sorry. Now, I mean, this is a very difficult question to answer. I mean, within our bank, within SEB, we have different departments that do this. The part that I represent, the technology needs to be proven before we can invest into that. What I'm looking forward to it, and what I'm trying to push internally is to work with the scientific community, with consultants from an engineering perspective, to learn more about these technologies, to have this strategic map so that we understand when something pops up that we need to be there. But usually this type of investments are made by venture cap, as Karina said, because that's where the risk can be taken on a certain level. We do it partially within our bank with our own money, but we invest clients' money, so we cannot take those risks initially. So as soon as they are proven, yes, we are there. we are, watching large companies that are looking at this and trying to buy that technology to integrate in their business model. That type of, encouragement or insight we can give in our active ownership dialogues towards companies when we talk to CEOs or CFOs, but we are not there. But it's very difficult, and we need to work more with the scientific community, and I'm trying to push that internally from our perspective, at least, so that we understand what's going on and what's going to happen. If that's an answer, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really important point that we've touched on in this discussion, is this collaborative component of actually working, across industry, into science, into policy, in various different ways. I mean, and Emma knows very well from at MESAM, the work and the research that is conducted there is very much in partnership with both industry and policy, in order to really, uncover those leverage points, because let me say we, but the collective way of solving these problems is with shared knowledge and shared insights that we can actually apply in practice. I'm wondering if anyone else would like to. We have one more question here. This is quite a big one. We've covered maybe some parts of it already, but this has got a bit more of a market angle to it. So in terms of the task ahead, in your minds, is the market sufficiently geared up to tackle its contribution to climate change? And if not, what needs to happen in the short and long term to make it a reality? We may have some of the similar red threads that we've talked about today. I'd like to ask Emma actually first, from a research perspective.
Yeah, no, I don't think the market is sufficiently geared up. I think the challenge is massive, and it's not. We're not where we need to be yet in terms of being geared up. So I think there's still a long ways to go. And I mean, a lot needs to happen in the short and the long term, but I think one thing that strikes me also is that financial market actors have had to learn a lot about sustainability and try to wrap their head around what does everything in the IPCC report mean and everything else. You have to become sort of climate experts, but then you also have the sustainability people who need to go the other way and also become more literate in how does the financial market work and so on. So I think that conversation in itself could be much more sophisticated if you could have also the sustainability expertise being more financially literate, if you want to call it that, in the same way as a lot of the financial market actors are going to have to be literate in anything to do with sustainability. And that's the journey that I think we're only in the beginning of.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Emma. We have 3 minutes left. I will wrap us up shortly, but I just want to open to the floor if there's any last parting words you'd like to share today. We'll start with Eric. Anything else to add?
No, great that we have started this conversation, and I'm really excited to see what this can lead to.
Fantastic. Yeah, I definitely would like to keep on talking to all of you. Karina.
Thank you from my side also. Really interesting to hear all the other sort of contributions here. And I think, summing up from our part is, we realize that investors alone cannot save the world. And, but we are part of this whole ecosystems of economic and, business and policy that can actually move the needle together. But we're really humble to the fact that we can only do so much, and we can choose what we invest in, and we can choose to sort of push those investments. But at the same time, we're really dependent on a lot of, actors doing sort of their share. Foreseeable policy environments with, no full-size subsidies would be, for example, a great help forward for many other industries. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Robert.
No, I mean, once again, thank you for a great conversation. As always, I agree with Emma. We are not geared at the moment, but with increased awareness and knowledge put into this from the industry, I think the financial industry has an immense possibility to be this enabler of the change that needs to come. And I think we need to run much faster than our legs can bear, basically, because we are behind. But I think we have a possibility here that we cannot ignore. It's just that we need to increase knowledge faster than we do, and we need to have the regulatory board behind us, basically politicians and regulations, and COP26, which I'm looking forward to what's coming out from there, just to put the next phase into that, because that's we need that, otherwise we cannot run, and that's important.
Yes, thank you very much. So in summation, I think the three sort of main things that I've picked up from today: legitimacy in terms of transition plans and business models, investor pressure, clear directives, and then collaboration with science, with policymakers, with getting those collective transition components into place. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been great. I hope all of our listeners found it as fascinating as I did today. For more information about upcoming events and activities that the SSE Alumni Office will be holding, please sign up for the newsletter or visit the website, and there'll also be a recording of this webinar circulated to you alongside a survey. So we all appreciate your feedback. Have a wonderful evening. And I'm just seeing Annette, if Annette wanted to say a word before we go. Thank you very much. It's been a great session.